can't quite remember what I was talking about before that cut off because it took so long to save. But um, basically, if you can identify positive feedback between one phenomenon and another, these are really significant points, um, yeah, to explore in the discussion of an excellence level question. So, for example, here we could talk about how an increased desire for communication um, would have placed a greater selection pressure on the phenotypes that conferred an advantage when it came to communication, such as, a certain shape of dental arcade or um, weight of the jaw or shape of the chin, etc. And this would have led to greater communication, which would have put more pressure on biological evolution, yada, yada, yada. And this is really the backbone when it comes to evolution and propagation of a trait over time um, in the direction of, um, optimal use as long as that selection pressure exists. So we're going to talk about positive feedback, quite a lot. And if you can identify it, well, then it is really useful and it shows your understanding at a higher level. Warmth. So again, we're still talking about biological evolution. Warmth that is provided by fire would have released the selection pressure, or at least reduced it, on the ability for the body to grow hair and store blubber and things like that. So those that had, more body hair or stored more fat did not hold as much of a survival advantage over individuals that could not. So there was a release in that selection pressure. So the body was able to, bodies of those that didn't have hair and didn't have blubber were not selected against. So we saw that hair reduced, blubber reduced, humans got a little bit more, reliant biologically on fire, as it is, expensive to be storing fat, and then it makes your survival against predators a bit more difficult. So again, there's a constant weigh out between advantages and disadvantages for every trait. Of course, the reduction on the selection pressure for body hair and blubber was also supplemented by the introduction of clothing as a result of encephalization. So, lots of these things are compounding and interrelated. And evolution is multifaceted. There's not just one feedback loop existing at one time. These are all constantly shifting and changing and influencing each other. So Allen's rule is another thing that I find really interesting, and you can look it up. Where's my Inuit? There he is. Man, this is such a mess. Allen's rule really suggests that there is a surface area to volume ratio advantage and correlation with latitude. So as you get closer to the poles that experience less heat throughout the year, you'll actually find that the gene pool is oriented more towards phenotypes that allow for storage of fat and things like that, and a shorter, wider, stockier stature in order to preserve heat, and that nearer the equator, or the latitudes that experience high levels of heat all year round, the gene pool is oriented to favor phenotypes that allow for radiation of heat, such as really long, skinny limbs. And you can see this in many animals. So if you look at rabbits from the poles versus hares from the equator, you'll recognize that their ears are totally different. They're way cuter and rounder and fluffier in the Arctic, and really skinny and lanky with these really big flat ears at the equator. And this is all, it totally makes sense, and it's named after a scientist that recognized the correlation between climate and phenotype frequencies in a population. So that's something you don't learn every day. Oh, I think someone's coming in here. Sorry, one second. And she's back. Sorry, I just don't have the mental capacity to be editing these videos, so please bear with. Okay, now we're looking at how fire and its provision of, cooking our food led to biological evolution. And we can recognize that processed food, so cooking, processing the food, pre-mastication and digestion, made it easier to digest. So there was less raw cellulose in our diet, which is the reason why frugivores and herbivores have such long, extensive guts, because it takes so long to break down raw cellulose and fiber in plant material. So that led to a reduction in the length of the gut, as there would have been selection against, again, expending energy on body parts that were just, a waste of space and energy, and selection for using that conserved energy on other things such as encephalization. Also shifts in selection pressures on the skull. So this comes back to that stuff we discussed in the exam question in terms of not expending energy on parts of the skull and temporal muscles and things like that that were selected for in order to process food that we don't need to anymore. So lots of things you can discuss there on how cooking our food led to evolution of the body. What else? Can't read it. So note, encephalization was selected against originally due to high energy demands. So before we were able to get such a high, revenue of energy from our food, having a big brain actually would have been selected against, as it just cost the body so much in terms of energy. But as soon as energy became cheap, because we were able to eat really nutrient-dense foods and spend less of the energy that we were gaining from that food and actually digesting it itself, suddenly that disadvantage to having a large brain was no longer relevant. So just recognizing that selection pressures on these body parts are constantly shifting, and we shift them ourselves with cultural evolution, and that there's a constant battle between pros and cons, and these can shift at any time. So having a large brain was once not useful and was actually cumbersome, and pressures shifted in a way that meant that having a large brain suddenly became a survival advantage in terms of outwitting predators and catching prey, etc. And suddenly it was really useful, and so energy was going to start being used there. What I want you to recognize is that I see that this is a misconception every year. Cooking your food does not increase the nutrients in that piece of food. The amount of nutrients in a piece of food is always the same. However, cooking the food means that you spend less of that nutrients in actually processing it, and so there is a larger margin that you can gain. So for example, if there was a piece of meat that contained 80 energies, but eating it raw meant you had to use up 60 energies, then actually you're only getting paid 20 energies at the end of eating that piece of meat. But if you can spend less of the energy processing it, so by cooking it, your body doesn't have to chew and digest as much, then I have a business degree, so I keep coming back to this, but your revenue will be higher if your costs are lower. I hope that makes sense, or is it just business brain? I'm sorry. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Again, positive feedback. The more energy conserved for cooking our food, that meant we could spend more of it on encephalization, meant that we had a bigger brain, so we used fire better, so we got better food, so we had more energy, so our brain got bigger, so we used fire better. Again, positive feedback leading to really big brains and really good control of fire. Protection. Tools and fire improved our survivability when it came to protecting us against predators, and this affected the body as we got weaker. So there was no need to have big, muscly, strong bodies because we had the tools to protect us. So we don't have talons, we don't have massive teeth, we don't have poison, we don't have any of the biological adaptations that might have come into our existence and been selected for because we chose a big brain. Really, the selection for large brains meant that we didn't need all of the other measures that help us survive. So our bodies have become really weak and useless because our brain is large and can compensate for protection. Also, using fire as protection would have probably led to hunting in packs and using fire as a means of herding animals and things like that. And this would have meant greater teamwork and socialization, improved communication. Again, we're talking about the areas of the brain that would have had to improve for this to be effective, such as Wernicke's area and Broca's areas. And other areas of the brain when we started using fire for art, death, and spirituality and communication, such as the cerebellum for precision and fine motor control of using fire and tools, and also the frontal lobe. When it comes to art, you can't create something that doesn't exist without a larger frontal lobe, which is responsible for abstract and logical thought. So all of these skeletal and endocranial structures would have had to shift over time to improve as we started using fire. I hope that makes sense. So I made all of those slides, and then I came to this slide and realized this is how I did it last year on the board, and I really could have just talked through this, but whatever. So the blue stuff here are all the ideas as to how fire provides us with different uses. The red stuff is cultural. Hopefully I touched on all of that. And the green stuff is biological as a result often of cultural evolution. So what have I got there? I've also got that hand evolution would have improved. Well, the hand would have evolved as we started making and using tools as a result of fire. So this is, quite tenuous links, but they are all relevant. And if you do state them and you do explain them well enough, that's really what's important. As long as you understand and you can justify the reasons that you've brought certain information into your answers, the mark schemes are quite generous. So what have I got there? Brain, skull, hand. Yes, another one. So using fire as light would have meant that our eyesight at night likely would have got worse because, we're using light instead. So that kind of links into the idea that our bodies got weaker as we started relying on things like fire for our survivability. Okay, I'm going to upload this onto Hapara, and I'd like you to have a go and submit it, and then I will upload a screencast again that goes through the mark scheme so that you can self-mark. The more opportunities that you exploit to practice exam questions, the more prepared you're going to be. There is absolutely no way around it. You have to get used to the format of an exam question. You can't just know the content, because you could know the whole book and get in there and just have absolutely no idea how the mark scheme is going to respond to the question. So this, in my opinion, is the best practice you can get for this external. Doing these past exam questions and then self-marking. That's the key. Understanding how the mark scheme is created and used to justify your grade. Okay, so please go and do that now, and I'm going to give you tomorrow's lesson as well to go and practice this question, and then you can mark it on Monday. Bye.